Listen, this is the police department. Talk to me, okay? Were you in the house or did you walk in the house?
Walk in the house.
Okay, you come home and you walk in the house and you saw this person laying on the floor. Who is the person to you?
For a prominent middle-aged married couple from Huntsville, Alabama, Memorial Day weekend 1992 was meant to be a chance to rekindle their romance after the daily rush of life kept them apart for far too long. Little did either of them know the tragedy would soon strike. Initially, the case seemed open and shut, a burglary gone horribly wrong. That is, until an unlikely tip led investigators to a pair of double-edged suspects. But was the final verdict as straightforward as it seemed, or a miscarriage of justice?
It didn't make a damn how Dr. Wilson got killed. The question was, who did it?
Hi, and welcome to M7 Crime Storytime. Today, we go back in time to 1992 and look into a case that still dominates the gossip grapevine in the Huntsville community. Jack Ray Wilson was born on May 5, 1937 in Chicago, Illinois. Prior to his move to Huntsville, there's not much known about his life. He'd been married and divorced and had 3 children with his first wife, Julia. Following the breakup of his marriage, he needed a fresh start and made the move to Huntsville, Alabama. While working toward building his own ophthalmology practice, Dr. Wilson consulted and performed eye surgeries at the Humana Hospital. Friends, employees, and patients described him as a kind man with a great sense of humor. He easily managed to integrate himself into the Huntsville community. Not only was he a gentleman, but a doctor with a charitable heart. In many instances, Jack Wilson helped his patients by treating them for free when they couldn't afford the medical fees.
I'd even hate to estimate how many people that Jack treated absolutely free because they needed medical help and they couldn't afford to pay.
Love soon found its way back into his life once again when he met his second wife, Betty Woods. Betty worked as a nurse at the same hospital where Jack was working. The duo had bonded while they were both monitoring a patient during the same shift. Following a whirlwind romance, Jack proposed to her, to which she happily said yes. The wedding took place in 1978. Despite their busy schedules, they were able to make their marriage work. Everyone who knew them saw a couple deeply in love.
He met every need that I or my children or my grandchildren had. He was a wonderful person.
Jack often spoiled his wife, lavishing her with expensive gifts and trips, while Betty doted on Jack. Together, they lived in a brick mansion in the affluent neighborhood of Boulder Circle. For the next 14 years, they shared a mostly peaceful relationship. However, there were the occasional arguments about Betty's alcohol issues and Jack's demanding work schedule. Added to their own personal problems was the issue of Jack's progressive Crohn's disease, which affected his digestive system. He was required to use a colostomy bag that led to the breakdown of their intimate relationship. But this time, Jack wanted to make it work. With the 1992 Memorial Day weekend fast approaching, he planned a romantic getaway just for the two of them to Santa Fe, New Mexico. Unfortunately, his romantic plan would never be realized. On Friday afternoon, May 22, 1992, Jack left his office at 4 p.m. He'd gone home to begin preparing for the Santa Fe trip the next morning. Neighbors walking by saw him come out and hammer in a political campaign sign on the front lawn using a metal baseball bat at around 4:30 p.m. that afternoon. That was the last time anyone saw him alive. At 9:30 p.m. that Friday night, Betty Wilson returned to the home she shared with her husband Jack from an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting in Birmingham. She entered the house and called out for him, but there was no answer. She made her way upstairs to start packing for the trip the next day. That's when she found Jack lying unconscious and bloodied outside the bedroom door in the hallway. Betty panicked and fled the house, fearing the intruder was still inside. She ran over to the neighbor's house and asked them to call 911 immediately.
Listen, this is the police department. Talk to me, okay? Were you in the house or did you walk in the house?
Walk in the house.
Okay, you come home and you walk in the house and you saw this person laying on the floor. Who is the person to you? Okay, do you know Do you know if the person that hurt him is still inside?
I don't know. I got I just...
Okay. Now you just go stand there and you don't go back to your house, okay?
The 911 dispatcher informed police that there was a burglary in progress at a property in the neighborhood of Boulder Circle. Police arrived within minutes of the call and entered the home of Dr. Jack Wilson and his wife Betty. When they found the body, it became clear that they were not dealing with just a burglary, but rather a homicide. Near the doctor's body, they found the possible murder weapon, a metal baseball bat. Police dogs were also brought in to sniff out any evidence the investigators may have missed. Police found a telephone line had been cut in the bedroom, and a green ski mask was found on the bed. A pistol box had been found open with ammunition inside, but no gun. Jack's wallet was found next to his shoes. There was no money in it, but all of his credit cards were still inside. A sweep through the house showed that the intruder did not attempt to ransack the other rooms. Most of the disturbance was contained in the bedroom. Strangely, there were no fingerprints found on the murder weapon or in the house. Police now had to rely on statements from witnesses to aid the investigation. Although the spouse is the first person that people would normally question, Betty Wilson was too distraught after seeing her husband's body to be interviewed. Instead, investigators turned to neighbors to recount anything unusual they may have seen or heard that afternoon, but none had seen anything out of the ordinary. The neighbors also insisted that Jack could not have had any enemies. He was well loved by the community at large for his charitable nature. Betty eventually calmed down enough to speak with investigators and provided them with the details of her day leading up to the discovery of her husband's body. She told them that she'd met Jack for lunch before they both parted ways. She'd gone on to do some last-minute shopping while Jack returned to the office. It was when she returned home that evening after attending her Alcoholics Anonymous meeting that she discovered Jack unconscious on the floor of the hallway. Her story seemed to check out, especially when she provided them with receipts from her shopping and witnesses from the AA meeting. The autopsy was conducted by State Medical Examiner Dr. Joseph Embry. He noted several lacerations on the victim's head, as well as a fractured skull. Wilson also suffered a fracture to his hyoid bone in his neck and a fractured right shoulder with a visible puncture wound. Both of his arms had been fractured, indicating he'd tried to defend himself, and he'd been stabbed twice in the abdomen. Dr. Embry concluded that Jack Wilson died as a result of blunt force trauma injuries to his head and upper body. However, he was not given the baseball bat, the alleged murder weapon, to examine for himself. The investigators from the Huntsville Forensic Department instead tested the blood found on the bat and found it to be a match with Jack Wilson's blood type. Having collected the evidence and conducted interviews, investigators now sat back down to review everything they knew so far. This was when they began to discover some discrepancies with the crime. The main problem was the crime scene itself. Investigators questioned the initial report of a burglary. There were none of the typical signs, such as open drawers, overturned furniture, or ransacked cupboards, as stated in the report made by police on the scene. The most disturbed area of the house was where the body of Jack Wilson was found. To investigators, it looked more like an inside job than a random burglary. This theory took hold with investigators. They questioned family members who all provided strong alibis for the day of the murder. They also rechecked Betty's credit card trail, the alibi she provided, and the witnesses who accounted for her whereabouts throughout the day. Their subsequent interviews with Betty painted a picture of harmony between the couple. They enjoyed each other's company and good humor. However, they also had their fair share of conflicts, which had impacted the marriage in an unpleasant way. Betty even admitted to having affairs with multiple men in an interview with the investigators. She also said that Jack's illness added fuel to the fire. However, both Jack and Betty were determined to work on their marriage and decided a trip away would do them and their relationship some good. Sadly, they never got the chance. Jack was murdered the day before the trip. Though hard to digest, investigators didn't regard these revelations as cause for concern. All married couples had problems at some time or the other. The investigation hit a dead end until a woman from Vincent, Alabama called into the Shelby County Sheriff's Office to tell them she'd overheard a conversation from a man who alleged he was hired to kill a doctor from Huntsville. She gave them a name, James White. The woman also admitted to police that James always talked big when he was drunk, and lately he'd been drunk pretty often. This tip, however, was the first break police had in the case and prompted them to investigate the lead further. Investigators made the trip to Vincent, Alabama, where 42-year-old James Dennison White lived in a trailer on the outskirts of the town since his divorce. He was working part-time as a handyman at Vincent Elementary School. A background check on White revealed a checkered past. White had received a dishonorable discharge while serving in Vietnam. He turned to alcohol and drugs to cope with the stress. He'd been in and out of prison and mental institutions and had been diagnosed as being delusional. White was involved in a prison escape and alleged kidnapping. Police questioned White regarding his involvement with the case, but as is the pattern with most criminals, White gave them the runaround. He told investigators a number of half-truths, made a number of contradictory statements, and denied everything from the beginning of the interview process. But after 10 hours of questioning, with the sun rising on a new day, White finally broke and admitted to being in the Wilson home the night of the murder. He was arrested and charged with the murder of Jack Wilson. Investigators were issued a search warrant for White's property, and in his trailer they found a pair of shoes with bloodstains. In the abandoned house next to his trailer, they found a gun, and in his truck, they found a book of poetry. While in custody, White started to tell investigators several stories, the most important of which was about a woman named Peggy Lowe, who taught first grade at Vincent Elementary School. He'd done some carpentry work for Peggy, whom he claimed became infatuated with him and began to tell him how unhappy she was in their marriage. He alleged that Peggy hinted at killing her husband, but ultimately decided against it. However, Peggy then allegedly asked White if it was possible he could help her sister with hiring a hitman to kill her husband instead. White said he told Peggy that he knew someone who could do the job for $20,000. Peggy replied that this amount was too much, as her sister was not in a good financial situation at the moment. They then agreed on an amount of $5,000, half to be paid before the murder and half after the deed was done. Although White's stories were not reliable, investigators followed up on the name White gave them and soon found a surprising link between the woman named Peggy Lowe and the victim, Dr. Jack Wilson. The name sounded familiar, but they couldn't quite place it until they read through their notes on the Wilson investigation and made a shocking discovery. Peggy was the twin sister of Jack's wife, Betty Wilson. What gave investigators more reason to take a deeper look into White's story was the evidence collected from the search of his property. The blood on White's shoe matched the blood type of Jack Wilson. The gun was registered to Betty Wilson, and the book found in White's van was checked out by Betty Wilson. Investigators were now beginning to turn their attention to sisters Betty Wilson and Peggy Lowe. Betty Joy Woods and Peggy Gay Woods were both born on July 14, 1945, to parents Nell, a factory worker, and Oscar, a policeman, in East Gadsden, Alabama. They were fraternal twins and had two older sisters. Their childhood was tough. Their father often took out his frustrations on the family emotionally and physically. As they grew into teenagers, the difference in their characters became more apparent. Peggy was a social butterfly with wholesome values and was even crowned homecoming queen. Betty, however, was the complete opposite. She was a rebel who defied authority and flouted her parents' rules. She preferred the company of boys and liked wild parties. They both married straight out of high school, had children, and got divorced. Peggy eventually moved to Vincent, where she met and married church deacon Wayne Lowe and dedicated herself to church and family. Betty, on the other hand, moved to Huntsville, where she continued to enjoy her hard-partying lifestyle. She enrolled herself in the nurses program at the University of Alabama with a specialization in kidney dialysis. In 1976, she met Dr. Jack Wilson while working as a nurse at Humana Hospital, and they eventually got married. According to a close few who knew the couple personally, Betty thrived in the lifestyle Jack's wealth provided her. The money she enjoyed. Her husband, though, was another issue. Initially, cracks started to appear when Jack became overwhelmed with work and had spent too many hours at the office away from his new wife. Betty started getting bored with the long absences and turned to alcohol as a coping mechanism for the loneliness. She often partied late into the night and returned intoxicated and ready to argue with Jack. Jack's disease had also become a burden on their relationship. With a colostomy bag attached to his body, Jack was unable to be freely intimate with Betty, and that had led to a breakdown in their physical relationship. According to a former housemaid, Shirley Green, there was an incident in which the bag loosened during intercourse between the couple, and fecal matter had sprayed across the room walls. This caused Betty to lose her cool with Jack. After the incident, Betty insisted that she and Jack keep separate bedrooms and separate lives. Green further attested to the fact that Betty began conducting affairs flagrantly in the marital house. Reports suggest that Betty eventually suffered a pancreatic-related illness and sought to clean up her act by joining AA. However, she continued to have affairs due to Jack's absence, something she admitted to investigators during the interview process. The couple, though, had both suffered failed marriages and did not want to go through another round of divorce proceedings. Instead, both Jack and Betty agreed to give their marriage another chance. It was no secret anymore that it had all been a well-constructed facade. For investigators, the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming, and they proceeded with the arrest of both Betty Wilson and Peggy Lowe on May 27, 1992, charging them with conspiracy to commit murder. Investigators and prosecutors had their suspects in custody, but still needed to develop a strong case in order to convict Betty and Peggy. Looking back at all the information they had collected through the course of the investigation, they theorized that Betty was motivated by greed. From interviews with people related to the investigation, they deduced that Betty Wilson loved the lifestyle Jack Wilson provided, but not the man himself. He had become a burden. Betty remained behind bars until her trial. With the help of her friends, Peggy Lowe was able to raise the bail amount of $150,000 and waited for her day in court at her home in Vincent, Alabama. Much of the investigation hinged on the testimony of James White. County District Attorney Mo Brooks agreed to offer James White a deal for his honest testimony at the trial of the sisters. The deal would allow for White to plead guilty to simple murder rather than capital murder, but with a mandatory life without parole sentence. White's court-appointed defense attorney, Roy Miller, negotiated for a charge of murder with the possibility of parole after 7 years or less. White agreed to the deal, which would save him from facing the death penalty. After months of questioning, White finally agreed to turn state's witness during the trials of both Peggy and Betty. He provided a much more coherent version of events which the prosecutor recorded. He explained how, over time, Peggy began to trust him and introduced him to her sister Betty. White's confession also linked the book of poetry to the case. He agreed to meet Betty at Lake Guntersville State Park, where she instructed a security guard to hand him the book with the agreed-upon money hidden inside. White met the sisters again, and Betty handed him her gun to carry out the murder. On May 22, 1992, Betty arranged to pick up White from the Parkway City Mall and drop him off at the house she shared with her husband. White waited for Jack inside the house and confronted him as he made his way upstairs. He then beat Jack with an unknown object before stabbing him and fleeing the residence. Betty then returned, paid him the outstanding money, and dropped him off back at his truck. On March 2, 1993, Betty Wilson's trial began in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. This was due to the immense publicity caused by the sensational crime and to avoid prejudice by the selected jury. White's repeated confession and the items recovered from a search of his property were brought in as evidence to the trial. Although there was no forensic evidence found in Betty's car to support White's claims, the case was still allowed to go ahead based on findings from the investigation. However, it was Betty's character that played a major role in the trial. Shirley Green, the former housekeeper, testified that Betty often ridiculed Jack and frequently carried out her affairs in the house. A close friend, Brenda Surha, said that Betty once remarked that she was fortunate her husband died. Brenda further stated that Betty had inquired about hiring a hitman to kill Jack. Marianne Lowe, who attended AA meetings with Betty, testified that she'd ended their friendship after discovering Betty used her as an alibi to carry out affairs. Errol Fitzpatrick testified to becoming Betty's lover after meeting at an AA meeting and carrying out affairs openly in her home until May 1992. Betty's defense argued that calling Fitzpatrick to the stand was an attempt to sully her reputation in the eyes of the jury by insinuating that she had an affair with an African-American man, thus using the race card to make her actions seem more immoral. An objection was made by prosecutors, and Fitzpatrick was excused after giving testimony. The next to testify were the security guards from Lake Guntersville State Park. The first, Keith Tucker, confirmed that James White had come to the gate and requested entry to pick up a book from Betty Wilson. He told White that he needed to call the front desk at the lodge in order to contact Betty Wilson. A second guard, Robert Hawkins, testified that he accompanied Betty Wilson to her car where she retrieved the book and asked him to give it to White at the entrance gate. Numerous witnesses came forward with claims of seeing White in the days prior to the murder around the neighborhood. It was also noted that he booked into the Ramada Inn on May 21, 1992, the day before the murder. Call records were also used to prove that White did, in fact, keep constant contact with Peggy Lowe in the build-up to the murder. Betty's defense argued that her interaction with White was based on trying to offer him help with regard to alcohol and drug addiction. The money was given to him to use to come to the AA meeting being held at Lake Guntersville State Park and book himself into one of the rooms. The calls between Peggy Lowe and James White were nothing more than a friend offering support in a time of need. The jury was presented with all the evidence and testimonies from both the defense and prosecution. For 2 days they deliberated before returning a guilty verdict in the case of Betty Wilson. The jury found that Betty Wilson had hired James White to murder her husband Jack Wilson in order to receive a financial payout from his estate. She was charged with capital murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. 6 months after Betty Wilson was convicted of conspiracy to murder and sentenced to life in prison, Peggy Lowe's trial began. A new judge and a different jury were appointed. She also had to her advantage a new forensic analyst, Dr. Chris Sperry, testifying at her trial. White once again took the stand at Peggy's trial. His confession this time seemed rather vague. He changed details, such as the time Betty Wilson had picked him up from the house after the murder. The prosecution presented the same evidence with the same witnesses at the trial of Peggy Lowe, but the major difference was that Peggy was nothing like her sister. No one had anything bad to say about the beloved first-grade teacher. She was presented as a devoted wife and mother, a dedicated member of the church, and always willing to help those in need. The testimony of Dr. Chris Sperry proved pivotal in poking holes into White's confession and the state's theory of how Jack Wilson was murdered. According to Sperry, he believed that White's confession of acting alone was false. He determined that it would have taken 2 people to attack and murder Jack Wilson, his reasons being that Jack was attacked somewhere else and moved to the hallway as evidenced by the lack of blood splatter at the initial crime scene. He also noted that White did not identify the baseball bat as the murder weapon. Sperry backed this up by explaining there were no hair fibers found on the bat. Had he been beaten with the bat, some transfer of fibers would have occurred. Sperry concluded that it was possible that a poker from the fireplace was used, given the type of puncture wound that was found on the victim's right shoulder. He further theorized that the weapon was taken away from the crime scene. The defense argued that Peggy Lowe had no reason to conspire to kill her brother-in-law, nor did she have any devious tendencies given the various testimonies that spoke highly of her character and role in the church and community. The jury took 2 hours to deliberate and returned with their decision. They found that White's confession was not credible and that the new forensic evidence poked many holes into his claim of acting alone in the murder of Jack Wilson. Based on the evidence and testimonies, the jury moved to acquit Peggy Lowe of all charges. life in Huntsville had begun to return to normal following the scandalous murder-for-hire case. However, the state's star witness threw a spanner into the works, planting a seed of doubt in many people's minds about the final verdict in Betty's case. In 1994, a year after the trials, James White recanted his confession. He alleged that he'd been made to testify against both Betty Wilson and Peggy Lowe by the investigators with a deal of a lesser charge. In his new statement, he wrote that he wanted to make peace and correct the wrongful and harmful injury he caused to Betty Wilson. He also added that he was prone to blackouts and could not remember the events prior to and during the murder of Jack Wilson. Prosecutors warned him that his recanting of his confession could lead to the death penalty being reinstated in his case. At a second appeal for Betty Wilson, James White only provided his name to the court and pleaded the fifth to all follow-up questions. Over the years, he's continued to change his story. He's been denied parole in both 2004 and 2020 and remains behind bars at the Limestone Correctional Center in Harvest, Alabama. Peggy Lowe returned to her teaching post after she was acquitted of all charges. Over the years, she's given numerous interviews in which she continued to protest Betty's innocence. Peggy and her husband, Wayne Lowe, eventually divorced. She married for a third time to a University of Alabama professor and now goes by the name Peggy Peck. To this day, she still stands by her sister Betty proclaiming her innocence. Betty Wilson has exhausted all her appeals, with the court remaining firm on the conviction that she was responsible for the murder-for-hire plot against her husband, Jack Wilson. Despite James White's constant changes to his story over the years, the court believes that his initial confession at her trial was credible and provided crucial evidence that led to her conviction. In 2006, Betty remarried while incarcerated at the Julie Tutwiler prison in Alabama to former Green Beret Bill Campbell. Campbell said he'd become fascinated by her plight after watching a 48 Hours episode about the case. The state of Alabama, however, does not allow for conjugal visits. In 2018, independent filmmaker Gene Adam Jr. began filming a documentary titled Finding Betty. It revolves around the case of Betty Wilson and what he calls a miscarriage of justice. For 4 years, he meticulously researched and compiled his own dossier regarding the case. In his documentary, Gene raises the question of how Peggy Lowe was acquitted while Betty Wilson was convicted based on the same evidence. He also points out the unreliable witness testimony provided by James White and the possibility that White was made to provide evidence under pressure from investigators. Another aspect he touches on is the character assassination of Betty White on trial. Gene hopes that Finding Betty will reach the right people and, in turn, help bring justice for a woman he believes has been wrongfully convicted. The case of Betty Wilson does certainly leave many questioning the outcome. Despite a lack of forensic evidence, there are too many uncanny similarities between witness testimonies and the killer's confession. There's also the belief that Betty's trial was something of a modern-day witch trial. Perhaps there's more to the story than meets the eye. But how could the same evidence convict one sister and acquit another? Was the investigation too focused on Betty as the scandalous wife who only wanted her husband's money? Or did she fall prey to a system that needed a scapegoat in such a high-profile investigation? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below. Until next time, stay safe and keep watching for more mysterious content. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel.